All right, this will be the first edition of Plus Money Picks. This will be for UFC Fight Night 28, Rozenstruik versus Sakai. Next week, I'm going to try to release a video a little bit earlier in the week. This card, the main event is lacking, which everyone is saying. I think it'll be a good test to see where both of these heavyweights are at, but I don't necessarily think that they're going to do much in this division, especially with Ngannou kind of just walking through Rozenstruik. I think Sakai, too, kind of is someone that will continue to struggle cardio-wise and is a little easy to figure out, especially with how Overeem exposed his takedown game. So we'll get into this card. The first fight will be Jordan Levitt and Claudio Poyus. So we're not necessarily going to spend too much time on this fight just because it's not one that I'm particularly interested in, just because I don't really think too much of either one of these fighters right now. Poyus obviously has a little bit more UFC experience. Jordan Levitt just had his actual UFC debut, but even that didn't really show anything. Just a quick kind of fluky knockout. But looking at this, basically, so right now the odds that I'm seeing, we have Jordan Levitt as a minus 200 favorite and Claudio Poyus coming in at plus 170. With it being said that we haven't seen too much out of Levitt, I don't see why anyone would necessarily lay minus 200 on this unless they were able to see a lot of tape on Levitt and saw something interesting. But what scares me away from this fight is that we haven't seen really any of Levitt striking. The only bit that I saw of him striking that looked pretty off and really funky, whereas we know that Poyus at least stays in fights with UFC strikers. He does get beat to crap, to be honest, sometimes. But he'll stay in fights and he'll continue grappling, which there was a fight where he looked like he was about to go out and his face was just completely battered and he still pulled off a submission right at the end of the third round. So we know that he could stay in fights even if he's behind. But for me, this isn't a fight that I'm necessarily going to touch. I do think that if you were going to bet on this fight, I would say take a shot on Poyus, just because we actually know that he has at least some striking, which we know that Levitt is super desperate to make this grappling. The only thing is, I think that Levitt's strong enough to kind of manhandle Poyus a little bit on the ground, and given that he also has ground game, I think they'll at least kind of cancel each other out, but it'll most likely be Levitt on top. So I'd say if you see this fight staying striking, it could be a good live betting opportunity because I don't necessarily think that Jordan Levitt could maintain a 3-round striking match. So the next fight we have is Zavala and Woodson. And this is a fight that I wish I had gone with my initial lean earlier because at one point Zavala, at least on BetOnline, was plus 200. And I thought that sounded crazy. And then I looked at a couple fights and kind of decided against it because lately I've been kind of feeling like I jump on certain things too early and then change my mind the week of. But then the more I looked at this fight, I ended up deciding that Zavala was one of the underdogs that I like on this card. So right now you can get Zavala, let's see. Zavala is plus 154 right now. I believe I got him at plus 165 when I finally decided to bet on this fight. When you're looking at stats, so the thing that's going to stand out to a lot of people is probably the reach advantage and then just the difference in size between these guys. Woodson is pretty solid with his boxing. I will say that that's an impressive part of his game, especially his jab and how he can kind of keep people away from him. But I think he can be controlled on the ground, and he doesn't look as good when you back him up against the fence. like when you really get his back on the fence. And so I think all that Zavala would really need to do is keep this on the fence, keep it close quarters, or do what he can to bring Woodson to the ground. I think when they're in the middle of the cage, if he could at least just start tagging and chipping away at Woodson's legs, that could be another way to slow him down. One thing that makes me nervous a bit is that Woodson has taken a year off, so we don't really know exactly what he's going to come back with after that year off. I think it is possible that he'll have improvements in his takedown defense and grappling, but if from a betting perspective, if you're looking for underdogs in this card, I do think that Zalal is someone that's durable, will most likely bring this to decision. Even if he does lose this fight, I think it's still going to be going 3 rounds and he'll be staying in there. But I think just because of the glaring weakness so far of Woodson with defending takedowns and not being so good grappling overall, I think that's definitely something that Zalal can take advantage of, and is why I'm going to be backing Zalal in this fight. Our next fight is going to be a women's MMA fight. It's going to be at flyweight between Marina Moroz and Manon Fioro. Initially, so I had started watching tape on Moroz first. Moroz fights out of Ukraine. She's an underdog right now. Currently, the odds have her as a plus 131. She's 5'7", 67-inch reach, which is basically the same for Fioro. So I started watching tape on Moroz first. And when I was watching her, I was thinking that she is a pretty good underdog, especially because a lot of times I do like taking underdogs in women's MMA fights, just because a lot of times they do play out pretty close, and sometimes just even with the variance in judging, you could really capitalize on a lot of underdog plays. So the things that I liked initially about Moroz were she does throw a lot of straight punches. I don't really like when fighters rely on hooks, just because a lot of times they're getting beat to the punch. They seem to kind of tire out quicker, and they just get tagged a lot. But I did also notice that she tends to really lunge forward a lot with her punches. So then she ends up getting hit pretty hard when people move to the side, and she gets tagged with body kicks a lot. She has been incorporating takedowns into her game a bit more, but I really don't like the way that she shoots takedowns. A lot of times she doesn't really level change too much. She kind of just leans into people and tries to run them over. There's not really a whole lot of complexity to her takedowns, I guess. She kind of just tries to run you over. And she also just tends to really gas out, or at least really slow down in the 3rd round. In multiple fights that I watched, she was doing really well in the first couple rounds, but then it just seems like her opponents tend to pour it on her in that 3rd round, which I really don't like for fights that are probably going to go to decision, just because I feel like a lot of times judges really do get swayed by how that last round looks, and if you didn't make those first 2 rounds dominant, you could easily lose a fight that way. And as soon as I started watching tape on Fioro, the one thing I was going through her record, she hasn't really fought a whole lot of quality competition. Victoria Leonardo, at least if you're going on her record, she doesn't have terrible losses or anything, but I don't think she's necessarily that impressive. And at least with the record that's listed on ESPN, she hadn't really fought anyone that had a lot of wins, at least at the time that she fought them. But she is definitely a more well-rounded striker. She could mix in any variety of strikes, really. She definitely has a power advantage. And I was thinking that the one thing that was going to hold me back is just because everyone talks about how great of a striker she is. I was thinking, well, I got to find some glaring hole in her grappling. But she tends to actually like getting in these exchanges where she's pushing people against the cage and kind of getting in over-under positions, clinch. And then I did see a fight from her, I believe it was some regional scene fight, um, but she was actually taking girls down. So I think she doesn't have as weak of a grappling game as people would think. I would not be surprised just because, I mean, that's the difference of going from a lower promotion to the UFC. Even if your game looked good there, it might not necessarily translate to the UFC. But I think it's not going to look too bad in that respect, and there's at least a good chance that Fioro will get up, um, even if she gets taken down. And I do think that Morose is most likely not going to go straight into grappling. She's only going to do that if she feels behind. But I do feel pretty good about taking Fioro in this spot. But Morose is a talented fighter, so I would not be surprised if she comes out here and does a lot better. Um, but I'm going to take Fioro either by decision or by possibly a late KO. I do think that Morose is pretty durable, so most likely, even if she's behind, this is going to go to decision. So yeah, my pick for this one will be Manon Fioro. This next fight, it's definitely one that I'm excited about just because I really did like Mason Jones' first fight in the UFC. I thought it was really impressive as a UFC debut. Currently, if we're looking at the line for his fight against Alan Patrick, Patrick is a plus 240 underdog, and Mason Jones is a minus 300 favorite. As far as how they match up, they're about the same height. Patrick is 5'11", and Mason Jones is 5'10". Patrick will have a 2-inch reach advantage. I'm not necessarily too worried about a reach advantage in this fight. Patrick, he'll most likely start with just going straight for takedowns, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be a huge issue in this fight for Mason Jones, just because, I don't know, his takedown game's pretty weak, and he has struggled with holding people down. And one thing that people say about Mason Jones is he's pretty difficult to hold down, and Davis was struggling to hold him down in their fight, so that's something that I do believe in. Davis is a pretty well-rounded fighter. So, yeah, I'm just not too worried about the ground game in this. I do think that Patrick will probably be throwing a lot of big kicks to kind of push Mason Jones away from him when he tries to come in with flurries. But it's just, I really don't like how Patrick, striking wise, he just relies on these big strikes. He doesn't really throw combos. And the fight that I watched that ended up making me just decide that I really just don't believe in Alan Patrick that much was his Scott Holtzman fight. He made Scott Holtzman look like a future champ, which in recent fights we've seen that that's just not the case. So looking at Mason Jones, I think that he should just force this to be a stand-up fight. I like his leg kicks. I like that he's a pressure fighter. He's going to be throwing more volume. He'll actually be throwing combinations. And I think this could play out a lot like the Holtzman fight. So Patrick's main weapon would be obviously the takedowns, working in ground game, but when you're watching his recent fights, it seems like even if he's fighting a non-grappler, his opponents just end up feeling so confident that they end up taking him down just to kind of guarantee that they win rounds and they get control time and that they don't get hit with a big strike. So I think even though this is Mason Jones' second fight in the UFC and he's got this big money line on him, I do think it's worth it. And that's why I've even started sprinkling Mason Jones into some of my parlays. Patrick, even if he's getting battered, he does stay in fights weirdly long. So I wouldn't be surprised if this does drag out to decision. But most likely, I think this will be a little bit of a later knockout for Mason Jones. I think Patrick's just going to take a lot of damage, possibly even on his back, but kind of just keep rolling out of it. And like I said, just kind of keeping distance with some of his strikes. But I do think that Mason Jones is just going to wear on him so much that this is going to lean heavily in Mason Jones' favor. So my pick for sure in this fight is Mason Jones. All right, next fight we have Trinaldo versus Muslim Salikov. This will be Trinaldo's first fight at 170. I am interested to see how Trinaldo looks at 170, but there's not really too much to indicate to me that I should be backing him here. As of right now, Salikov is a minus 250 favorite, and Trinaldo's plus 210. As far as they match up pretty well, even though this is Trinaldo's first fight at 170, I think they at least kind of helped him out by making it someone that size-wise he's not really too different from. They have about the same reach. There's not a huge difference in height. And even though Trinaldo's 42, Salikov's 37, so at least he's fighting someone that's at least getting up there in age as well. But 42 in the UFC, especially with how many UFC fights Trinaldo has had, he's definitely the one coming in here with more damage and more to hold him back. I think if Trinaldo's smart, he's going to try to make this more grapple heavy. Salikov, I believe his only 2 losses are by submission. But he's not terrible grappling. He could defend takedowns and stuff. But I just think that because Trinaldo was getting dropped by Jai Herbert. He's getting rocked a lot, actually, in that fight. And I don't know. I do think that Salikov does pack a lot of power, both in his hands and with his kicks, especially his spinning kicks, which he likes to throw pretty often. And it doesn't really seem to bother him too much cardio-wise. Because he's low volume, even throwing strikes like that don't really mess with him being able to go 3 rounds. With that being said, Trinaldo will be probably a little bit higher volume, not too much though. I think Salikov, he does have good cage control. He could kind of keep his opponents. He could be the one controlling the middle of the cage, and I think he'll be pretty confident in this one, knowing that Trinaldo's coming up from 155. So yeah, he has a lot of power. He'll keep his hands low, and I do expect to see a lot of spinning kicks out of Salikov in this fight. I don't know. It is somewhat unpredictable because of this being Trinaldo's first fight at 170, but I do feel pretty confident in taking Salikov just because I feel like he's a pretty well-rounded fighter, or at least just a solid fighter, and he'll have the power advantage, and just he'll be more prepared for that 170 frame. This is where he's been fighting. And I think that this move to 170 for Trinaldo really was just one of those end of career kind of things, and he just can't make 155. So I think Trinaldo's on his way out. Salikov still has a bit to show in the UFC, so I'm going to take the younger fighter in this one with Muslim Salikov. The next fight's going to be a heavyweight between Tanner Boser and Ilir Latifi. Latifi currently is plus 170, and Tanner Boser is coming in at minus 200. Tanner Boser is going to have a 4-inch height advantage in this, but not necessarily that much of a reach advantage. I don't think that the numbers on Tapology are necessarily accurate, but even other numbers that I've seen, it's only about maybe a 2-inch advantage for Tanner Boser. Tanner Boser, he does have good movement for heavyweight. He is pretty quick with his with his strikes, and he is pretty good at bouncing in and out. I do like his use of low kicks. But the thing in this fight is he just really hasn't been tested in the UFC with anyone that could really take him down. And just hasn't had too many people that are willing to just grind him up against the cage for 3 rounds. I don't think he's really fought someone that decided to just go all in with that game plan, which is exactly what Ilir Latifi is, I think. So when Latifi first came up to heavyweight and fought Derek Lewis, I thought he did kind of look a little tubby. I don't necessarily think that he's going to come in that same exact shape for this one, just because Tanner Boser is a little bit lighter of a heavyweight. So I think a lot of Latifi's weight in that last fight was just because he was going against Derek Lewis, which Derek Lewis is a very heavy heavyweight. He's just a dense guy. So I think he purposely did that. In that fight, Latifi did have pretty good cage control of Derek Lewis. He only got credit for a couple takedowns, but I thought technically he had a lot of control time if you're counting all of the time that he was pushing against the fence. It's just, I think if there is a decent amount of time where they're just freely moving around the cage, Latifi will be outstruck. So I think he'll have to amp up the volume a little bit, even if it's just a lot of quick short punches. He can't just be all pressuring against the cage. He has to be mixing in at least some short strikes up to the face, or chipping away at the leg with knees. Because I think that was one thing that's just kind of messed with him a lot. When I watched his fight against Lewis initially, when I was watching it live, I was kind of expecting that some judges would side more with Latifi, but being that it was in Houston, obviously that wasn't going to be the case. I think Lewis was clearly going to get the hometown rub there. When I watched it again, I could totally see that Lewis won that fight just because there wasn't a whole lot of action. So if you were going off of damage, Lewis definitely won there. But just looking at this from the grappler versus striker comparison, I just don't feel confident enough in Tanner Boser in this matchup to be taking him at minus 200. And I think Latifi is a pretty viable threat to him, which is why I actually did take Latifi as an underdog. I did put that bet in. So I think there's a really solid chance that Latifi grinds out a decision. I would just like to see him ramp up the striking volume a little bit, do what he can to actually go for full takedowns. That might kind of wear on him by round 3, but I think he could bank 2 rounds if he's really implementing his game plan. So yeah, once again, my pick in this one's going to be Latifi by decision. Next up in the card, we have another women's flyweight fight. This one will be between Montana De La Rosa and Ariane Lipsky. Looking at the odds right now, Montana De La Rosa is getting a lot of praise. She's at minus 275, and Lipsky's at plus 235. And a lot of that is just because Lipsky just really hasn't looked that impressive in the UFC. And what a lot of people are going to point out about her is that she just got dominated by Antonina Shevchenko on the ground, which Antonina Shevchenko just got absolutely obliterated on the ground by Andrea Lee. So I just really don't feel confident at all in any part of Ariane Lipsky's game. I think even her Luana Carolina submission, Carolina kind of almost put her in that position. It wasn't like she did a whole lot of work to bring it there. Yeah, she will lose submissions a lot and give up position. So I don't think, even though there is some talk of her having a decent ground game, I don't think it's enough to really threaten Montana De La Rosa. De La Rosa just made it through fighting Mayra Bueno Silva, who I think has way better has a way better submission game. Yeah, and just Ariane Lipsky, she just really doesn't seem hard to keep down. It seems like when the people that she's fought, even in fights that she's won, uh, she just kind of gets held down when it goes there. So I think if anything, she might be smarter to keep it standing. She does have possibly a little bit of a power advantage if she could start working in some of her hooks and high kicks. But I really do think that Montana De La Rosa will probably edge her out even on the feet. And with Montana De La Rosa's takedown game, I think she should be able to easily take this to the ground. I don't think Lipsky's going to offer out too much resistance to those takedowns. De La Rosa, she's only been submitted by Mackenzie Dern. I don't really necessarily see Lipsky submitting her. And she's only been knocked out by Cynthia Calvillo, which losing like that to Calvillo, I don't really hold against anyone in that division. So from that aspect, Montana De La Rosa, she could really take damage. So I think even if she's kind of losing out on some striking exchanges with Lipsky, she's still going to be able to get in her face and take her down. She does also throw more straight punches, so I think she could be beating Lipsky to the punch a bit. And I just feel more confident that De La Rosa is going to be there round 3, implementing the game plan that she's been going for the whole time. So I think my pick in this one's definitely going to be De La Rosa by decision. And she's someone that I felt confident enough that I've already even been putting her in parlays, even with how heavily the odds are in her favor. The next fight we'll look at is at featherweight. It's between Kamwilla Kirk and Makwan Amirkhani. Kamwilla Kirk, he's the fighter that I looked into first, just because he'll be debuting, and I wanted to see if he's just another one of these can crushers that's getting brought into the UFC. A lot of times when you look into a debuting fighter that has a decent record, when you're looking at the people they face, they might be 0-1, 1-3. Those have these terrible records, but that's not really the case for Kamwilla Kirk. He does have a win over Kevin Kroom. I mean, Kevin Kroom's 21-13, so he's lost to plenty of people. And when you saw his fight against, I believe it was Caceres, not necessarily the most impressive UFC fighter, but at least Kamwilla Kirk has beat UFC competition. With that being said, his Contender Series fight against Quarantillo is one of the things that makes me not really want to back Kamwilla Kirk in this fight. He looked good in the first round. He is pretty good at bringing the fight to the ground. He's got decent ground and pound, and he does have a submission game. But then when you're watching that fight, he just literally had nothing after that first round. He just stopped throwing completely, essentially, and ended up getting finished by Billy Q, which isn't even necessarily a fighter that I think too much of in the UFC. I think he has potential, but losing to him in that way isn't going to make you look good against someone when you're facing someone like Makwan Amirkhani. But I think Kamwilla Kirk, now that he's in the UFC, he will beat some UFC competition. I'd like to see him succeed. He has a pretty cool nickname and walkout music and everything, and I like the Hawaiian UFC fighters. And there are things to like about his game. He has a nice, like I said, nice takedown game. He could pull off trips and everything. But he just does put a lot into his shots, and I could see him tiring out in this fight, especially because he took on short notice. Makwan Amirkhani, he's a little bit more patient on the feet, and I think if this goes to the ground, Amirkhani just has a pretty raw submission attack. I don't think he'll be too scared of Kamwilla Kirk's ground and pound. I think he'll just use it as an opportunity to fish for submissions. He's only been knocked out by Burgos, and that was even pretty late in the fight. And I know that people bring up the Barboza fight as something to bring up that's bad about Amirkhani, but the fact that he lasted through that, even with the damage that he was taking, and in the beginning I thought he held up okay striking wise with Barboza. So I think Amirkhani, being a veteran, in the UFC. I think he should be able to handle this fight against, like I said, someone taking this fight on short notice and coming from the regional scene. And given how the fight looked between Kamala Kirk and Billy Q, I do see Makwan Amirkhani pulling off a finish in this fight. Submission or knockout. I think the knockout would come by Kamala Kirk being tired out, Amirkhani bringing it to the ground and ground and pounding him. But if this goes to late rounds at all, Kamala Kirk just doesn't really win decisions. So I think if this starts going into the later rounds and you're on Amirkhani, you should start feeling pretty good about your pick. All right, and then next we have a middleweight fight between Tom Breeze and Antonio Arroyo. Currently, for odds on this one, I have Tom Breeze at minus 250 and Antonio Arroyo at plus 210. I mean, given how Arroyo's last fights have gone, it's not really surprising that they would put him as a pretty decent underdog. So when I was tape studying this one, and then for size-wise, these guys match up pretty evenly, so I wouldn't be too worried about any kind of reach advantage or anything. But I looked into Tom Breeze first. When you're looking at his ground game, he could be tricky on the ground. I don't necessarily feel like he should try to go there too much in this fight, just because sometimes you also see him get worked on the ground by people, at least by better grapplers like Brendan Allen. And then Akhmedov kind of manhandled him on the ground. Yeah, he has some solid tricks as a grappler, but I think he's safer to keep this fight standing. Yeah, just because his recent losses really were just from getting outstrength on the ground. And if he keeps this standing, he does have pretty solid boxing. And I think that's how he'll take advantage of Antonio Arroyo. Antonio Arroyo, he'll most likely just come out and start digging into the legs of Tom Breeze. He'll throw more kicks. He'll keep his hands low. But I don't know. He struggles cardio wise, and I don't think it's just as far as momentum wise, he's not exactly going in the best direction. So I think if Breeze really just does start peppering him up with a jab, he'll not only feel the damage, but I think he'll kind of break. That being said, Antonio Arroyo, he hasn't been knocked out, so I don't really necessarily see Tom Breeze getting the knockout over him. But I do see this being a pretty dominant decision win for Tom Breeze. All right, and then in the next fight we have, it's a middleweight fight between Dusko Todorovic and Gregory Rodriguez. Rodriguez will be making his debut in the UFC. We have seen him on Contender Series where he lost to Williams. I think it's Jordan Williams. This is one fight where I was kind of going back and forth on who to pick. I believe I'm just going to end up going with Todorovic in this one, really. He's right now minus 141. Rodriguez coming back at plus 121. I just think, I mean, the one thing that I really don't like about Dusko Todorovic is that he does the tall man's defense where he kind of just leans back and moves his head out of the way. He doesn't really put his hands up, which I do think leaves him vulnerable to people that can kind of throw long, straight strikes in his face, or even fighters that could really back him up and kind of back him into the cage to where he can't really use that head movement to his advantage as much. Todorovic is going to want to be pushing his opponents up against the cage himself, because like I said, he's vulnerable when he's against the cage, but he tends to like having it where he could just throw short strikes, pressure his opponents, and possibly even take them down. When you're looking at Rodriguez is probably the oldest 29-year-old that I've ever seen. I think he's 21. He's 29, like Dana White's 29. like I said, he was KO'd by Jordan Williams, who isn't really, he's not a big middleweight because of his issues with being able to even cut weight. Um, he does have power, but the way that he was knocked out by Williams doesn't really give me any confidence that he'll fare well with Dusko. He's faced worse competition. I think I wish he would throw more straight punches if he was going to have a solid chance against Dusko. And I think coming in short notice, I don't know how much he'll really be able to come up with a solid game plan to take him out. He has a decent takedown game, I guess, which would be one way to get at Todorovic. But in some of the fights I was watching, he does lose position. He does lose position on those takedowns a bit. So I just overall don't feel too confident in Rodriguez. I could get why some people would take him in this spot. I think he is an underdog with a chance just because Todorovic does have weaknesses. His defense, while it can look good sometimes because his head movement's okay, it's just not the best defense to rely on. And yeah, I think Dusko will still continue to lose some fights, but I just don't necessarily think that this is one of them. So I'll take Todorovic, and I think this fight most likely finishes inside the distance. So if you didn't really want to take a side, I'd say just kind of choose a round that you think this is going to end in. Right now, the side I'm looking at, they have it set at 1.5 with the over/under. I wouldn't necessarily feel too comfortable with the under in that, but maybe the fight doesn't start round 3, or just anything with it inside the distance. Just pick your fighter and say inside the distance. But my pick for this one's going to be Dusko, and I'll take him by knockout. All right, so our next fight's going to be a welterweight fight that I'm pretty excited about. It's between Miguel Baeza and Santiago Ponzinibio. So Miguel Baeza, he's 10-0, he's undefeated. And then, of course, all fans know about Ponzinibio. He's been in the game a while. Someone that people used to be really impressed with. Both these guys match up size-wise pretty well, pretty even. Right now, Baeza's -120 and Ponzinibio's +100. And honestly, I could understand it. When you're looking at least Ponzinibio's last fight, he looked pretty horrible against Jingliang, and Baeza's just been looking pretty unstoppable. I think there is a really solid chance that he knocks out Ponzinibio, especially because Ponzinibio's coming on a pretty quick turnaround after getting knocked out pretty bad. So I think, given Baeza's history, how much power he packs, I think it's a pretty straightforward pick betting wise, especially because the numbers are pretty close right now. I don't see why you wouldn't go with the younger fighter in Baeza. Ponzinibio's just had his run with injuries recently, and coming back just didn't look that good. I mean, if you took him as an underdog play, if you're taking Ponzinibio as an underdog, I wouldn't necessarily think you were done for doing that, just because of the career that he's had and the potential that, if he returns to his old ways, he could look pretty good in this fight. But Baeza, I kind of think, has the advantage in a lot of spots, and I think if you're going off of just general likelihood, it's most likely that Baeza is going to come out here and continue to win. So I'm looking forward to this fight. I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with Baeza after this, because I think this is a pretty meaningful fight for the welterweight division. So I'll be taking Baeza, and I don't know, it's hard to decide whether I should take him as just a decision or KO, but I'm leaning towards knockout just because of Ponzinibio coming on a short turnaround from just getting knocked out pretty brutally. Okay, and the next one that we have is between Roman Dolidze and Laureano Saraprillo. It's going to be at middleweight. Odds right now, Dolidze is minus 150, and Laureano Saraprillo is at plus 130. I think the only reason that the odds aren't more spread in Dolidze's favor is just because of how his last fight went. He didn't really look too good against Trevin Giles. But my standpoint on this one's pretty straightforward. Dolidze, he's just gonna be a lot bigger in this fight. I mean, he just came down from 205, and people didn't even really think that he was small for 205. So he'll definitely be a bit bigger. He has a decent reach advantage, about the same height, but he will have a reach advantage. He definitely, yeah, he'll have more power in his strikes, I'd say. A huge grappling advantage. I mean, Saraprillo is not even doing that well grappling against 170s. I really don't understand why he took this fight, to be honest. He will be a better striker overall and have a little bit more speed, but I just can't really see myself backing Saraprillo in this. I just think it was unwise for him to take this fight, but I guess there is the potential that he surprises everyone, and that could kind of kickstart another run in his career where people believe in him a bit more. But this one's straightforward for me. I'm going to take Dolidze. I haven't really decided outcome-wise what I think is most likely, because I think Dolidze could just keep taking him down and go to decision. But because of the size difference, I think a knockout or a submission is pretty plausible in this fight. And that brings us to our co-main event. It'll be at heavyweight between Walt Harris and Marcin Tybura. Currently, Tybura is minus 165. Walt Harris is at plus 140. Those odds on Tybura were basically what I took him at when I started putting him in parlays. I kind of feel like maybe I shouldn't have put Tybura in parlays just because looking at this, it is a heavyweight fight, and Walt Harris does have finishing power. So it is possible that he could knock out Tybura. But that's really Harris's only path to winning this fight. He'll have a little bit of a reach advantage, a little bit of a height advantage. And yeah, Tybura has been knocked out, but I just think that most likely Tybura is going to want to make this grapple heavy. When you're looking at Walt Harris's takedown defense stat-wise, it looks decent, but that just comes from fights where he defended a lot of takedowns. But even in those fights that he defended a lot of takedowns, he got taken down and lost those fights. And Overeem was able to hold him down pretty easily, which is one reason that I started feeling pretty confident that Tybura should be able to do the same thing. And Walt Harris just doesn't have the best cardio, so if Tybura really is making this grapple heavy, I think it's just really going to wear on Walt Harris, and Tybura should either be able to skate to a decision or possibly ground and pound knockout with Walt Harris. And just on top of that, Tybura has momentum. He's on a 4-fight winning streak, whereas Walt Harris is on a 2-fight losing streak. And there is a decent chance that he gets cut if he loses this fight, I think, because you're looking at him, he's almost 38. So I think being on a 3-fight skid, being that old, it would be difficult for the UFC to hold on to him, especially with the stance they've been taking recently with cutting some of their older guys that aren't looking so good. So, yeah, I feel decently confident in taking Tybura in this spot. All right, and last we have the main event that nobody asked for between Augusto Sakai and Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Right now, I have Rozenstruik at minus 128 and Augusto Sakai at plus 108. As far as how these guys match up, height and reach pretty similar. Sakai is going to be slightly higher volume. I do think that he has a good clinch and tie plum game, and he'll probably want to keep this up against the fence. I did like some of the high kicks that I saw from him in his fight. I like that he can mix that in. Um, but just one of the things I don't like too much is that since he does want to put this against the cage, he's going to be coming forward decently against Rozenstruik. And Rozenstruik being a counter striker, I think that might kind of open up some opportunities for Rozenstruik to catch him on the way in. And then on top of that, so I'm glad that Sakai's last fight, we got to see what he looks like in a 5-round fight. And in that fight, cardio was an issue for Sakai, which some of that I think really was because takedowns became a factor when he was fighting Overeem. And that's really why he got knocked out. He was handling strikes on the feet okay, but once it was on the ground, he just kind of got pounded out and cut up. But seeing that cardio drop and his hands start dropping in that fight as it got into the later rounds isn't something that I like to see because Rozenstruik, since he is low volume, he's able to stay in there for 5-round fights. You don't see like a huge drop in how he looks as the fight goes on. He really does have power in both hands. And his takedown defense, which I don't think will necessarily be too much of a factor in this. It has been okay. He's just a strong guy, so he could kind of keep people off of him. What I saw, maybe weakness-wise, is, I mean, like a lot of fighters, with straight punches coming at him, he doesn't do as well, those quick to the point punches. But Dos Santos was having success with straight rights and overhands. And Gon was able to pick him apart with jabs, just another like straight strike to him. But Gon in that scenario had a reach advantage, which I think was a pretty big part of why that worked. Yeah, and I think so. The one way that Sakai could really implement his game plan is if he is able to pressure Jairzinho Rozenstruik against the cage. If he does make this more of a clinch game and keep Rozenstruik's back against the fence. But just because of the strength of Rozenstruik, he could kind of pull out of those situations, and he knows that a lot of people are going to do that to him. So he doesn't get stuck there too long. One thing that I think does work against Rozenstruik if it goes long, like if this fight was to go to decision, is his corners constantly yelling for more volume, which I think is a big tip-off to judges that he's not throwing enough. Because if your corner is literally saying you're not throwing enough, it just doesn't look that good. So I wish that wasn't really the case, but I think that Sakai really will give an opportunity to Rozenstruik to land a big punch. I wish Rozenstruik felt more confident with going to the ground, ground and pound scenario wise, to kind of follow up on that, because Sakai hasn't really been getting dropped too much standing. But it's hard for me to take Sakai in this fight, being that it's 5 rounds. If this was a 3-round fight and there was less time for Rozenstruik to catch him, and Sakai could feel confident in his cardio for a 3-round fight with just kind of doing what he can to get it inside, and maybe you only have to take, a handful of punches from Rozenstruik. That's the scenario that I would feel better about Sakai. But as of right now, just looking at Jairzinho Rozenstruik's history and everything, it's hard not to take him in this fight. There really is a decent chance, I think more than people are saying, that Sakai pulls this off, especially if somehow it really does go to decision. It probably will be Sakai winning a decision. I don't see Rozenstruik throwing enough to win a decision. But I would say look at this ending possibly more like 3rd or 4th round, really. I think it's more going to be when Sakai really starts dropping cardio-wise, which probably will be in those later rounds. But I'm going to go with Rozenstruik by KO for this one. So those are all my picks and predictions for this card. I do recommend any bettors out there Watch as many videos as you can and get as many opinions as you can to help make your decisions for how you're going to bet on this card. Yeah, just don't ever rely on one person too much. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. I am trying to build a decent following and just build this from the ground up. Next week, I plan on releasing a video more Monday, Tuesday, possibly earlier. It just depends on how quickly I could get through fight tape. So yeah, looking forward to this card, looking forward to this channel growing, and please remember to like and subscribe.